Today we're talking about giving effective feedback. And so we've talked about establishing trust, picking an appropriate time as soon as possible, as long as the other person's emotionally ready for it. We've talked about that we want to begin by listening and understand the other person's perspective on things, praising more than we criticize. The next thing we're going to talk about is giving specific feedback to the other person. We want to make sure to provide people specific feedback. We want to make sure that it's detailed enough so they can understand what we're talking about and so that it's actionable, that they understand what they need to do differently going forward. And so just like when we talked about receiving feedback graciously, you needed to communicate 4 things. When you're providing feedback, you also need to provide those same 4 pieces of information. I'm going to use the example of a student who routinely comes in late for class and how I might go about giving them feedback about that. And of course, I would start out by talking to them about that first. Like I have students who are commuting in from like Daly City or whatever, they're routinely coming in 10 to 15 minutes late because they have to work and then they have to drive to campus. Like that's why I would start out by listening, because I want to understand their situation and understand what's going on with them. But assuming that I had that discussion with them and they perhaps gave me excuses like, oh, traffic or whatever, then when I would give them feedback, this is what it would look like. So the first thing I want to do is provide context. And in this case, I might say something like, we do a lot of activities in class, we do a lot of discussion, and it's actually much more difficult to handle classroom management with my style of teaching. If you're just lecturing, it's pretty easy to handle classroom management, but when we're pivoting from quizzes to discussions to activities, it's really important that everything flows well and that everything's organized to create the most effective learning environment for everyone. And I put a lot of thought into what I want each class to look like and how I want it to play out. And that's really important to me, that my classes flow well and are very organized. So that would be the context I provide them. The next thing I would do is talk about their behavior. So I would say, you routinely come into class 10 or 15 minutes late. It's really important here that you focus on behavior and not character. So you might be tempted to say something like, oh, you're being disrespectful, or you're obviously very disorganized. Those are critiquing people's character. And when you critique people's character, the first thing they do is get defensive, because I promise you, most people do not see themselves as disrespectful or disorganized. And even if they do, they don't want you telling them that. And so they immediately get defensive. And a person cannot be defensive and simultaneously open to hearing feedback and making changes. Those 2 things are mutually exclusive. And so as soon as you critique people's character, they get defensive. The other thing about critiquing people's character is that it is difficult, if not impossible, to change our character. It is easier, although sometimes very difficult as well, but it's easier to change our behavior. And so when you give people feedback about their character, you've essentially given them an impossible task, that it's very difficult to change that. When you focus on their behavior, you let them know exactly what you expect of them, and you give them an avenue, a venue for change. And so really, when giving feedback, this is one of the most important things, to focus on behavior. And if you have an impression in your head of someone as lazy, disrespectful, disorganized, and you want to tell them that, don't. Instead, think to yourself, why do I have this impression? What are the things that they do? What are the specific behaviors that give me that impression? And then when you give them feedback, focus on those behaviors, not their character. If you want to vent about them, vent to someone else. Don't vent to them. The next thing you want to do is talk about the impact of their behavior. Okay, so I might say something like, you come in 10 or 15 minutes late, and by that time we've already started an activity, and maybe there's an odd number of people, and so you go in to join your partner, but you don't know what's going on, and so I have to catch you up, and that really has a negative impact on your partner. Or I might say, we'll be in the middle of a discussion and you'll come in and you put your stuff down all noisily and you distract from all the other students. And so the impact of your behavior is that you're negatively affecting the learning environment for all the other students. It's not so much about you missing the first 10 or 15 minutes of content, although that is very important as well, but it's really about the negative impact you have on the learning environment for all of the students. And it's really important to communicate this because 9 times out of 10, the person does not realize that, right? They are oblivious to the impact that they have. When a student comes in late, they don't realize the extent to which that throws off the conversation, that throws off the flow of the class. They don't realize the extent to which that has a negative impact on their partner. They were not in the class before they came in, right? So they don't know what it was like before they came in. They literally do not know. They do not have that understanding, that perspective. And so they're not aware of how their coming in late impacts that situation. And so it's incredibly important to focus on impact because you're letting people know what is the consequence of their behavior. Why, not just what is the behavior, but why does it need to change? What is the negative impact of it? The last thing we want to express is reaction, our emotional reaction. Now, you do not always need to express this to people. Especially in a business setting, it might be inappropriate or it could cause the other person to be defensive. I think the more in personal relationships, in friendships, in romantic relationships, this might be something, this can often be very helpful to express. And it can also be helpful to express in certain business scenarios. You have to use your judgment, you have to use your discernment. So I might say something like, I put a lot of time and effort into making sure my classes flow well. I try to do a really good job with classroom management. I try to create the best learning environment that I can in the classroom. And I find it incredibly frustrating when you come in and just, in a single blow, throw off all of that classroom management and all of that planning. And it's just incredibly frustrating for me. So again, you don't always have to do that. You have to read the person, you have to read the situation to see what's appropriate. But your emotions are often on your face anyway. So sometimes making it explicit can be helpful. Sometimes it can give people insight into why you're reacting so strongly or why you're giving them feedback in the first place. So use your judgment.
I do want to talk a little bit about what I mean by relevant feedback because that is very important. First of all, feedback needs to be relevant to job performance. I have a colleague who is responsible for finding clients for one of my leadership courses. We do group projects, and she's responsible for finding clients. And she writes all of her emails in bright blue Comic Sans, which drives me nuts. I find it very unprofessional. And I want, I like want to tell her like, no, you need, for my class, you need to use like black regular font. However, she does a great job finding clients, and the clients always speak really well of her. She is very good at her job. And so what business is it of mine what font she uses in her emails, right? Now, if she were struggling to find clients and I thought it was because she was being unprofessional, then maybe that's a discussion we could have. But if someone is doing their job well, then let them do it. Robert Frost said, you can tell a man what to do, but don't tell him how to do it. If someone is performing well, let them do it the way that they want to. Give them the freedom, the autonomy to do it the way they want, as long as they are being successful. Make sure that your feedback is relevant to job performance. Lastly, make sure that the feedback is relevant to what the person is trying to achieve. So, using another kickboxing example, I train with a lot of different partners, and invariably they give me feedback that, oh, hey, you're doing this wrong with your punches, or you need to work on this with your kicks. And they're absolutely right. They are 100% accurate about all the things they critique me about. However, it's really difficult to learn a new skill and get good at it, and I am doing lots and lots and lots of things wrong. both with punches and kicks. And each day I can really only focus on one or two things to improve on. And so they might give me feedback on something that I'm not working on that day. And so, yes, they're right. And yes, it's accurate feedback, but it's not very helpful because I only have enough bandwidth to deal with one thing at a time. And that's outside of where my focus is. So make sure that when you give people feedback, it's relevant to what they care about, their performance expectations.
We're talking about giving effective feedback today, and so far we've talked about establishing trust, picking an appropriate time, begin by listening, praising more than we criticize, and giving specific feedback. The next thing we'll talk about is agreeing on SMART goals.
It is very cruel to tell someone what they are doing wrong and then not tell them how to improve it. When we agree on SMART goals, we give people a path forward to be successful. It's not, hey, these are your shortcomings and this is what you're bad at, and all right, that's it. It's this is an area for growth, and this is how you can achieve that growth. Let's set a goal for performance improvement. Let's create a path forward so you actually improve. Let's not give the critical feedback and then just end there. And of course, we use the SMART goal structure in order to do that. I've talked a lot about giving critical feedback today because I think people struggle more with giving critical feedback than giving positive feedback. But I've emphasized giving praise, and in regard to SMART goals too, when you set SMART goals for performance improvement, focus on building strengths as well as addressing weaknesses. Make people feel as if they get to flaunt their strengths with their goals, not just address their weaknesses. So whenever you're making SMART goals for people, make sure you have goals that focus on building their strengths as well as addressing their weaknesses.
Today we talked about 6 principles for delivering effective feedback, and those are establishing trust, picking an appropriate time, beginning by listening, praising more than we criticize, giving specific feedback, and agreeing on SMART goals.